Harlem, New York City, November 1935. The body was never supposed to be found that quickly. A man lay face down on the corner of 110th Street. No wallet, no identification. 3 bullets, grouped tight. The signature of a professional. Police arrived within minutes. They assumed it was another Harlem numbers dispute. Another black man dead in a neighborhood the city had already decided didn't matter. They were wrong. Within 48 hours, the killing sent tremors not through Harlem, but through the most powerful organized crime network in American history. Phone calls were made in Italian. Meetings were called in rooms without windows. Because the man connected to that body wasn't just a street operator. He was a link. A bridge between 2 worlds that were never supposed to touch publicly, but privately, could not survive without each other. His death exposed something the Commission had worked years to conceal, that Lucky Luciano, architect of the modern American Mafia, did not fully control New York City, not without Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy Johnson didn't work for Luciano. He worked beside him, on terms that no Italian boss had ever granted a black man in the history of organized crime. The arrangement was unprecedented. It was also fragile. And when it began to crack, it revealed the true architecture of power in New York, one that no history book bothered to map correctly. This is that map. They came from opposite ends of the same hunger. Salvatore Lucania was born in Sicily in 1897. Dirt floors. No future. His family arrived in New York when he was 10, deposited into the Lower East Side like cargo. One more immigrant family the city would either consume or ignore. He chose a third option. By 14, he was running a protection racket for Jewish and Italian kids walking to school. By 20, he was moving heroin for the 5 Points gang. He didn't climb the criminal world. He redesigned it. Ellsworth Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. He arrived in Harlem as a child, during the first great wave of the Great Migration, black families moving north, chasing the promise of dignity. What they found instead was a different architecture of exclusion. Harlem had jazz, culture, brilliance. It also had poverty engineered from the outside, banks that wouldn't lend, landlords who gouged, police who taxed rather than protected. Bumpy Johnson didn't choose crime out of nihilism. He chose it because every legitimate door had a lock he wasn't permitted to touch. Both men understood one foundational truth in a city that excluded you by design. Power had to be seized, never requested. That shared understanding would eventually pull them into the same orbit, but the road there ran directly through blood, through a woman named Stephanie St. Clair, and through a war for Harlem's most lucrative invisible economy. To understand why Luciano needed Bumpy Johnson, you must first understand what Harlem represented financially. The numbers racket was not gambling in the casual sense. It was infrastructure. Every morning across Harlem, hundreds of thousands of small bets, nickels, dimes, quarters, flowed through a network of runners, collectors, and controllers. By conservative estimates, the Harlem numbers operation generated $30 million annually by the early 1930s. It was the most reliable cash economy in the borough. Untaxed, unregulated, and until Luciano's reorganization of the American Mafia in 1931, almost entirely controlled by black and Caribbean operators. Chief among them was Stephanie St. Clair, Madame Queen, a Martinique-born woman of ferocious intelligence who had built the most disciplined numbers operation in Harlem through 2 decades of brutal competition. She was meticulous, politically connected, and completely unwilling to surrender her empire to Italian expansion. Bumpy Johnson was her enforcer, then her proc, then something more complicated, a strategic mind she recognized as generational. When Dutch Schultz moved aggressively into Harlem in 1931, attempting to seize the numbers operation by force, bribing police, threatening runners, murdering holdouts, it was Bumpy Johnson who organized the resistance. He did not simply defend territory. He made Schultz's occupation costly enough that it required attention from the commission itself. Luciano was watching. A man who could make Arthur Flegenheimer, one of the most violent operators in New York, bleed resources without a formal army behind him, was not a man to be destroyed. He was a man to be understood. The war came to a head in 1935. Dutch Schultz had by then secured judicial protection, police cooperation, and partial control over several Harlem numbers banks. He had done it through saturation, overwhelming force applied slowly enough that each individual act of violence seemed isolated. A runner beaten here, a banker threatened there. The pattern only became visible when you stepped back far enough to see the whole canvas. Bumpy Johnson saw the canvas. He had spent 4 years making Schultz's occupation expensive, hijacking collection routes, turning runners back to St. Clair's operation, ensuring that every dollar Schultz extracted from Harlem cost him $2 in enforcement. It was asymmetric warfare conducted entirely without recognition from the men who ran the city's formal power structures. But the mathematics were shifting. Schultz was absorbing the losses. His political connections were deepening. And Bumpy Johnson, operating without the institutional backing of the Commission, was approaching the ceiling of what individual resistance could achieve. Then the Commission made its own calculation. Thomas Dewey, the relentless Manhattan prosecutor building his career on organized crime convictions, had fixed his attention on Schultz. Dutch, characteristically, proposed the most direct solution: assassinate Dewey. The Commission refused. Murdering a federal prosecutor would bring consequences no criminal organization could survive. When Schultz threatened to proceed unilaterally, the decision was made. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot at the Palace Chop House in Newark. He died 30 hours later. Harlem's numbers empire was now unclaimed territory, and Luciano moved immediately. Luciano's move into Harlem was not simply territorial ambition. It was defensive architecture. By 1935, Thomas Dewey had already convicted dozens of mid-level organized crime figures. He was building toward something larger, a prosecution that would reach the Commission itself. Luciano understood that the coming legal pressure required two things simultaneously: consolidated revenue streams and political insulation. Harlem's numbers operation provided both. The cash was obvious: $30 million annually, flowing through untraceable small denominations, was the kind of liquidity that funded lawyers, judges, and political favors without leaving ledger entries. But the political dimension was more sophisticated than simple bribery. Tammany Hall, New York's democratic political machine, had governed the city's patronage economy for decades. Its power rested on delivering block votes reliably. Harlem represented an enormous and growing voting population. Whoever controlled Harlem's street economy controlled Harlem's political loyalty. And whoever controlled that loyalty had leverage inside Tammany that no amount of direct cash payment could replicate. Luciano needed a Harlem operator who understood both dimensions, the street and the political. Someone whose authority the community recognized as legitimate within its own internal logic. Someone who could deliver order without triggering the kind of visible brutality that attracted federal attention. Stephanie Saint. Clair was too independent and too publicly combative. The remaining Harlem operators were too fractured. Bumpy Johnson was the only figure who commanded genuine respect across both the criminal and civilian populations of Harlem, a distinction that would prove, in the years ahead, to be worth more than any formal commission title. Luciano made the arrangement direct and unprecedented. Johnson would control Harlem's numbers operation autonomously. Luciano's organization would receive a negotiated percentage. In return, Johnson received something no black organized crime figure had ever been formally granted: commission protection. It was a partnership dressed as tribute. The arrangement held for years. On the surface, it functioned with remarkable efficiency. Harlem's numbers operation ran with disciplined consistency. Luciano's percentage arrived reliably. Political relationships remained insulated. Dewey's investigators circled the periphery, but found no clean entry point into the Harlem structure, partly because Johnson ran it with genuine organizational intelligence, and partly because the community itself provided a wall of protective silence that no Italian operator could have constructed or maintained. But beneath the surface, the architecture was under permanent stress. The first pressure point was internal to the commission itself. Several of Luciano's captains viewed the Johnson arrangement with unconcealed contempt. Not because it was financially unsound, the numbers spoke too clearly for that argument, but because it represented a symbolic violation of the racial hierarchy they considered foundational to their own authority. Granting commission protection to a black operator, regardless of the financial logic, established a precedent they feared more than they valued the revenue. They never challenged Luciano directly. Instead, they applied pressure through incremental encroachment, sending associates into Harlem's peripheral operations, renegotiating collection terms with individual runners, inserting Italian intermediaries into distribution chains that Johnson had built and staffed himself. Each individual act was deniable. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. Johnson was being slowly surrounded. The second pressure point arrived from outside, and it wore a prosecutor's suit. By 1936, Dewey had assembled enough evidence to move against Luciano directly. The charges were constructed around compulsory prostitution, a case built on coerced testimony from women Luciano's associates had exploited across Manhattan. The legal architecture was imperfect. Dewey knew it. He proceeded anyway. On June 7, 1936, Lucky Luciano was convicted on 62 counts. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years. From his cell in Dannemora prison, Luciano could no longer protect anyone, including Bumpy Johnson. Prison did not remove Luciano from power entirely. The commission continued operating. Messages moved through lawyers, through visitors, through intermediaries whose loyalty had been purchased across decades. Luciano remained a presence, diminished but not extinguished. The organization he had architected was specifically designed to survive the incarceration of any single figure, including its founder. But surviving and protecting were different obligations, and in the calculus of survival, Bumpy Johnson represented a liability the weakened commission could no longer afford to defend. The captains who had always resented the arrangement moved first. They did not execute Johnson directly. That would have created precisely the kind of Harlem disruption that made the arrangement valuable in the first place. Instead, they deployed a more surgical instrument: withdrawal. Commission protection was quietly rescinded. Italian associates who had previously kept rival operators at a distance were reassigned. The invisible wall that had surrounded Johnson's operation for years simply ceased to exist. Johnson didn't receive notification. He received consequences. Rival operators, some Italian, some independent Harlem figures who had spent years waiting for exactly this moment, began moving against his network simultaneously. Too coordinated to be coincidental. Too precise to be spontaneous. In 1937, Bumpy Johnson was arrested on narcotics charges. The evidence was substantial. The timing was not accidental. And the legal resources that might previously have been directed toward his defense materialized only partially, enough to suggest the relationship still existed, not enough to actually preserve it. He was convicted. He served 10 years in Alcatraz. Luciano, from his own cell, said nothing publicly. That silence was its own verdict. In Bumpy Johnson's absence, Harlem's organized economy collapsed inward, not dramatically, not with a single visible rupture, but with the slow, grinding deterioration that follows when a disciplined organizing intelligence is removed from a complex system and replaced with competing fragments of unchecked ambition. The numbers operation fractured across a dozen smaller operators, each controlling a few blocks, each without the political relationships or institutional backing that had made Johnson's structure coherent. Italian encroachment accelerated. Independent operators who had previously coexisted under Johnson's enforced equilibrium began eliminating each other with a kind of visible street violence that attracted exactly the federal attention the previous arrangement had been designed to prevent. Harlem's civilian population absorbed the consequences directly. The informal economic protections Johnson had maintained, the codes of conduct that kept civilian businesses insulated from street-level extortion, that kept violence contained within the criminal hierarchy rather than spilling into residential blocks, dissolved without a figure possessing both the authority and the genuine community investment to enforce them. Dewey, meanwhile, constructed his Luciano conviction into a political career that carried him to the New York governorship and 2 Republican presidential nominations. The prosecution that dismantled the arrangement between Luciano and Johnson became the foundation of a legitimate political ascent, organized crime's defeat, monetized into democratic capital. Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, his sentence commuted in partial recognition of wartime intelligence cooperation with the United States Navy. He never returned to New York. Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem in 1947. He found a neighborhood that had been waiting, and a criminal landscape that had been picked apart in his absence. He rebuilt, methodically, without commission protection, without institutional backing, on reputation alone. It took years. It was never quite the same. Here is what this story actually reveals. Not about crime, about power. Lucky Luciano built the most sophisticated criminal organization in American history, a structure so architecturally sound that it survived his own imprisonment, his own deportation, his own erasure from the city he had redesigned. He was, by any analytical measure, a genius of institutional construction. And yet, he could not rule New York completely without a man the institution he built was structurally designed to exclude. That contradiction was never resolved. It was managed, temporarily, imperfectly, at enormous human cost to the man who made the arrangement functional. When convenience expired, so did loyalty. Johnson was not betrayed in a moment of passion or panic. He was betrayed through the cold administrative withdrawal of protection, which is perhaps the most honest form of betrayal organized power ever produces. No anger, no confrontation, simply the removal of a shield, followed by the patience to watch what happened next. Luciano understood something most rulers eventually discover, that the boundaries drawn to define who belongs inside a power structure are never purely ideological. They are negotiable until they become inconvenient to negotiate. Then they become absolute again. Bumpy Johnson understood something rarer, that operating inside a system designed against you, extracting from it what dignity and protection you could, for as long as you could, on terms that were never truly equal, was not collaboration. It was survival conducted at the highest possible level. On the corner of 110th Street, where this story began, the city continued moving. It always does. Indifferent to the precise arrangements that kept it ordered. Indifferent to the men those arrangements consumed.